We really appreciate you spending some time with us, Colin, and helping us understand a little bit more about this thing called democracy and where we are right now. In your role with the UH Public Policy Center, perhaps you can give us a little bit of foundation.
So the Public Policy Center has engaged in a lot of different projects, and one of our more recent projects really is survey research, because we believe that really for a democracy to run well, our policymakers have to understand how people are thinking about issues. And in Hawaii, we haven't been all that good about listening to people. We don't have a long-standing poll. In the past, we haven't had a lot of that infrastructure. So some of our work has been trying to build that up, to dig a little deeper, to listen a little more carefully and closely to how people are thinking about the policy issues that affect them today. Relatively recently, we did, I think, one of the largest surveys on attitudes towards tourism that has ever been done by a non-government research entity in the state. So this was independently funded. It wasn't run by HTA or any other state agency. And we asked folks a lot of questions. How do they feel about the tourism industry? What policies might they be willing to explore to reform it? And that, I think, was pretty helpful to policymakers as they began to think about ways to change our approach to, what has been the leading industry in this state since at least the 1960s.
And that's so important, not only listening, but also having the public have a venue to share. That's the basic premise of democracy, right? Is citizen engagement.
Exactly. And, policymakers often hear from people who are very opposed to an issue or very supportive of an issue, but they don't often have access to that big picture. And that, to my mind, is what the survey research provides. It doesn't always get you specific answers. You have to do interviews and other things for that, but it does provide a broad perspective to understand what everybody thinks, not just those who are the most vocal.
So taking that information that's most recent and applying it to where we are right now is really helpful. But perhaps you can take us back a little bit. I'm worried personally.
Sure. I don't think anyone who's been watching what's gone on recently could be anything but worried. Nationally, our democracy, I think, has been under attack, and locally we have our challenges too. And I think for people who've studied the history of Hawaii and especially its post-statehood history, there was a moment in time, particularly in the late 60s, I would say, through the 70s, the period of the 1978 Constitutional Convention, where Hawaii was, I think, one of the leading democracies of the United States, where we had some of the highest rates of voter turnout, where the legislature would regularly be at the leading edge of policy issues, from environmentalism to land use regulations to social issues. And at some point along the way, maybe in the mid-90s, a lot of that began to collapse, and we ended up in a situation where we had one of the lowest voter turnout rates in the nation, where our legislature seemed to consistently be behind the ball, kind of playing catch-up to states on the U.S. continent. That's something we want to get back that pride. The sense that this is a small place that can still do big things.
Do you think that transition happened because people got too comfortable or too complacent or taking for granted the fact that we have this system?
Lila, I think there's an element of truth to that. If you look at the people who were part of the legislature back in that earlier period, these were people who really understood struggle. And they really felt passionately about making life better for everybody. But they came from a background of true deprivation. And I think, that really led, to their commitment to making things better through honest government and public policy. And I think we have lost a little bit of that. Perhaps people are a little too comfortable. They don't really see it as a necessity. A lot of people in the legislature now come from relatively comfortable backgrounds. That's true throughout the nation, but here in Hawaii too, who don't always, I think, experience the urgency of poverty or houselessness in a way that an earlier generation really knew more what that was like.
Well, without revealing too much, I am of that generation that grew up in the 60s and 70s when we were comfortable here, but the world was in a mess. Maybe not dissimilar from now, but something in society was compelling us to be involved and to speak up. And if we look at democracy foundation of citizen engagement, that's what worries me right now.
And you were part of a special generation, and I think it was because of a lot of those international events, the Vietnam War, for example. I mean, if you look at who is still active in politics, it really, in some ways, is still dominated by people of that generation, people who were politicized at a relatively early age. You think of some of our leaders, like, for example, Governor Abercrombie, who got his start really as an anti-war protester. You can see examples of that where people were so frustrated that it forced them into politics, and they gained those skills that have stayed with them for the rest of their lives. I think there's a little bit less of that, and it may have something to do with our retreat into more virtual spaces. That might contribute to part of it. I think that a sense of cynicism contributes to part of it too. When I speak to my students, I often find that they're sometimes the most cynical people I've ever met. I mean, they don't have a lot of faith in our public institutions. And, interestingly, when they spend more time at the legislature or working with people in the public sector, that usually improves their opinion. I mean, they usually end up thinking, actually, there's a lot of people here who care deeply and are working really hard.
So as we move toward the end of our conversation today, and your point well made that this generation maybe needs something. What might that be?
I mean, one thing we can start with, I think, is improving civic education in our schools. That's something that used to be at the core of a lot of the curriculum that was offered. And I think it has been, as the emphasis has grown on math and English skills in particular, we've kind of left that out. And I think we need to reintegrate that. I think as much as possible, we need to provide opportunities for young people to be involved in politics from a relatively early age. One way where we've done that is allowing 16-year-olds to register to vote. But unfortunately, our public schools haven't quite embraced that as much as they might. So I hope to see more progress there. Really thinking of our public education system as a way to help people become more comfortable participating, to help them be comfortable with voting, to be comfortable with testifying. And those are skills that they'll keep with them forever.
And perhaps urging our incumbent elected people, as well as nonprofit organizations and businesses, to speak about these things, not only voting, but being engaged more than service projects, but really being engaged in some of the solutions.
I hope they are. I mean, and I hope that our legislators see these opportunities to connect with the public as something beyond just an obligation that they have to fulfill for legal reasons, but really an opportunity, especially with young people, to encourage them to become involved in the process.
Well, parting words for our audience.
Don't end up just being cynical. That won't solve the problem for anyone. If you're angry, that's good. Anger is an important emotion, but channel that anger to get involved, to start working on an issue that you know a little bit about and care about, and take the risk to get involved. It'll be a little scary at first, but once you've done it, I think most people feel really empowered from that experience.
Well, thank you again for your time. Your energy is inspiring, and I know our viewing audience appreciates you as well. Thank you.
Great to be here. Thank you.
We've just spoken with Colin Moore, Executive Director of the UH Public Policy Center.